One horse wandered onto her land. The whole herd had followed it there. The first thing I noticed was the horse. A blue roan, maybe 15 hands, one white sock on the left foreleg. She was standing in the creek bed below the ridge where I'd made camp, drinking slow and steady the way a horse drinks when it hasn't had water in a while. Calm about it. No panic, no looking back over her shoulder. Whatever she'd left behind, she'd put enough distance between herself and it to feel all right about standing still in a stranger's creek. I watched her from the ridge for a while. The sun was still behind the mountains, but the sky was going pale gold above them, and the roan's gray coat picked up that color along her back. My own horse, the sorrel I'd been riding since Laramie, had his ears up watching her too. He knew her somehow, or thought he did, the way horses sometimes recognize a kind from a long distance. I didn't go down right away. That's something a man learns after enough years on the move. A loose horse on open range means one of three things. Somebody lost her, somebody let her go, or she got away from something you don't want to ride into in the dark. I waited until I could see the hole draw below me, and then I went down. The roan let me approach. I caught the halter, plain leather, no markings, and stood with her a minute while she finished at the water. The sorrel came along and they touched noses and neither one spooked. I walked her back up toward the fire, tied her loose to a juniper branch, and started breaking camp. Whoever she belonged to would either come looking or they wouldn't. I didn't know then that the whole rest of my life was tied to that roan mare. Her name was Della Marsh. She rode out to my camp about an hour after first light alone, no rifle on the saddle but a pistol on her hip that she wasn't shy about. She was maybe 45, 47, dark hair going silver at the temples. She had the kind of face that had been good-looking a long time and was still good-looking but in a different way now, harder edges, more in the eyes. When she pulled up she looked at the roan first, then at me, then back at the roan. She said, "That's my horse." I said I figured as much. She said, "You lead her back here to camp or she come in on her own." I said she'd come in on her own, down to the creek, and I'd caught her and kept her out of courtesy. She looked at me a while after that, sizing me up the way a rancher looks at a piece of fence, noting what's held and what hasn't. She said her name. She said the roan's name was Lily. She said Lily had a habit of pushing fences in the night, had been doing it since she was 2 years old, and that she was sorry for the inconvenience. I said there wasn't any inconvenience. She nodded once, short. She gathered Lily's lead and turned to go, and then she stopped and looked back at me the way a person looks back when they're going to say something they've thought twice about. "You headed somewhere particular," she said. I told her not particularly. "There's work," she said, "if you're not opposed to it." I hadn't been looking for work. I'd left a situation in New Mexico that I was still putting distance between myself and nothing legal, just old grief taking up too much room. I'd been riding north with no plan except north. But I said I'd come take a look, and that was how it started. The Marsh place was 3 miles east of where I'd camped, tucked into a wide, shallow valley with a creek running through it and hills on 3 sides that would catch a north wind and break it. Someone had chosen that site with sense. There's the kind of homestead a man builds when he's looking at the next season, and there's the kind he builds when he's looking at the next 20 years, and this was the second kind. She'd had 40 acres of good grass once, she told me, and she still had 38 of it, but the 2 she'd lost were the 2 that had the best water access on the south boundary, and she'd been fighting the loss of them in her head every morning since. 2 acres. The size wasn't what stayed with her, it was the principle of it, the way a wound stays not because of its size, but because of how it was made. The house was a good size, solid, built by a man who'd meant to stay. Low-roofed, stone foundation, 2 windows on the south side to catch the winter sun. She'd kept it up, the mortar was maintained, no soft spots in the porch boards, the door hung true. The fence lines were in decent shape. Maybe not what they should be, but not shamefully below it either. The barn was better than the house, newer boards on the south wall, properly repaired, doors hung on good hardware. She'd prioritized her animals, which told me something about her I could respect. You learn a lot about a person from what they fix first and what they let go. She had 16 head of cattle and 4 horses beside Lily. She had a hand named Pickett who was 63 years old and had a bad knee that had been getting worse since the previous winter. She had no sons, no daughters, one dead husband 3 years gone. She had a neighbor named Cordell Tate who'd made her 2 offers on the place and whose men had made her fences need more repair than they would have otherwise. She told me all this while she showed me around, in the same flat voice she'd used on the ridge. No complaint in it, no appeal, just the facts of the situation laid out clean, the way a general tells a new man where the ground lies before the fighting starts. She'd given herself this same accounting every morning for 3 years, I suspected, and by now it came out without feeling attached to it, the feeling having been worked down to something she carried without showing. I asked about Tate. She said he ran cattle on the South Ridge, had water on his own land but never thought he had enough of it, and had the kind of money that made a man believe the world owed him more than he already had. I asked if his men had done anything beyond fence work. She looked at me and said, "Not yet." I asked how long the old hand could keep going. She said Pickett would work until he fell over, and there was nothing to be done about that. And the way she said it told me she'd tried once, and it hadn't gone well. I told her I'd stay a while and help with what needed helping. She said she'd pay me fair. I told her not to worry about the pay. She looked at me then like I'd said something in a foreign language, and I realized she hadn't had anybody offer to do anything for her in a long time without a price attached, without wanting something in return that wasn't wages. She didn't say thank you. She just nodded again, that same short nod, and told me the bunkhouse was around back and that supper was at 6. That was in April. By the time the first real heat came, I'd settled in so deep I'd stopped thinking about New Mexico. Old Pickett took to me easy enough, which surprised me, because he was the type of man who doesn't take to anybody easy. He'd worked the Marsh place since before Della's husband, her husband's name had been Robert. She said it exactly that often. Once, since before Robert Marsh had bought the land, which was 18 years back. He carried the place in his body the way old hands do, knew where the soft spots in the pasture were after rain, knew which fence post was going to need replacing before it looked like it needed replacing, knew the creek behavior in July when the snowmelt stopped. He was also bone honest with me inside the first week. He said, "She won't ask for help and she won't tell you when something's bad. You got to watch for it." I said I'd noticed that. He said, "Tate sent a man over here in February. Didn't come to talk business. Came to look around. Came to see how much winter had taken off the herd and whether she was down enough in money to be scared." I asked what happened. "She talked to him at the fence line," Pickett said, "with the pistol on her hip and her chin up. He left, but he left with what he came for." I sat with that a while. Pickett said, "She ain't scared. That ain't the problem. The problem is she don't have enough weight to put on the other end of the scale. A woman alone, even a good strong one, the other side knows it. They're patient." I'd seen that kind of patience before. Seen it used on people who had nothing to throw back at it. It wasn't courage on the other side. It was just arithmetic. They count what you have. They count what you don't have. They wait until the difference is large enough. I thought about that for the next few days while I worked. I was good at the work. I won't make less of it than it was. I'd spent 20 years on various ranches and drives, and I knew cattle the way some men know card games, in my blood, no thinking required. I could read a fence line in 10 seconds. I could look at a calf and tell you what kind of trouble it was heading for. I could shoe a horse that didn't want to be shod, which is a particular skill, and I could fix machinery well enough to keep it running another season even when it was ready to quit. Della watched me work. She didn't say much about it, but I felt her watching, the way you feel sun on your back without turning around. I wasn't performing for her. I was just doing what needed doing. But I knew she was taking inventory in a different way than she had that first morning on the ridge. Tate's men started in June. First it was small. A section of the north fence cut, not broken, cut, which meant wire cutters, which meant intention. 3 of her cattle had wandered through before Pickett found it. He patched it himself and didn't tell Della, and she found out anyway, and they had a quiet argument about it in the barn that I wasn't supposed to hear and did. Then a gate was left open on the east pasture. 2 calves got loose. I spent half a day in the breaks finding them. Then somebody put something dead, I never found out what, some kind of carcass, in the upper reach of the creek, above where the cattle drank. The water went rank for 5 days. The cattle wouldn't touch it. We hauled water in buckets, 40-gallon trips back and forth, Pickett and me, 4 days running until the creek cleared itself. I watched Della during that stretch. Watched her the way you watch a structure in hard weather, looking for what holds and what doesn't. She didn't complain. She didn't cry, at least not where I could see it. What she did was work. She was up before me and still working when I turned in. She ate standing at the kitchen counter some mornings because sitting down cost time. She took Pickett's best days and stretched them, and on his bad days she did his work too without noting it aloud. Once, late in the 3rd day of hauling water, I came back to the trough from the creek, and she was sitting on an upturned bucket with her hands in her lap, not moving, just sitting. That was the only time I saw her stop. Maybe 30 seconds. Then she stood up, picked up the empty buckets, and went back to the creek. That 30 seconds told me more about what she was dealing with than anything she'd said. None of it was enough to break her. That's not what it was meant to do. It was meant to cost her. Time, money, the herd's weight, her sleep. Small blows, patient and steady. I rode to the South Ridge one morning and found the boundary fence and stood at it for a while looking at Tate's land. Big operation. Good grass, well watered for all the complaining he did about water. 3, maybe 4 hands that I could see working in the distance. A proper bunkhouse, newer than Della's. New fencing along the boundary, which meant money spent recently. I studied the land on his side for a long time. The lay of it, where the water ran. The color of the grass compared to Della's grass, which was a different green. Her creek fed differently, slower, richer, the kind of water that made grass that cattle wanted more. I hadn't known that about the water until I stood there and looked at the difference from the ridge. I didn't do anything, I just looked. A man who means to take something from you, his land tells you what he really needs versus what he says he needs. What Tate's land told me was that he didn't need more water to survive. He needed more water to win. Those are different things. One comes from fear and one comes from appetite, and they require different responses. On the ride back, I thought about what Pickett had said. The scale. What she could put on it versus what they were putting on it. And I thought about the thing I'd been carrying since New Mexico, the thing I'd been riding away from, which was not a crime, but was the kind of weight a man accumulates when he's made choices in his life that cost other people. I'd been a ranch foreman down there, 12 years with one outfit. The man who owned it was not a good man. I'd known that and stayed anyway because the work was good and I was comfortable, and you tell yourself a comfortable lie long enough it stops sounding like a lie. When he'd finally done something that I couldn't stand behind, I'd walked. But walking wasn't enough. I'd walked a year too late and I knew it. So I understood something about arithmetic, about waiting too long to put weight on the other side of the scale. I came back from the ridge, and I found Della in the barn doing something to a harness that didn't really need doing, which was how I'd learned she worked through things she was angry about. I stood in the doorway and told her what I thought was coming. She set the harness down and looked at me. I said Tate wasn't going to be satisfied with small trouble. The small trouble was to soften her. The real offer would come after he'd taken enough of her margin that she'd have less to fight with. She said she knew that. I said I wasn't sure she knew how close he might be to thinking she was soft enough. She said she knew that too. I said, what would you need to make the math work for you? She was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't know. She knew exactly. She'd been calculating it in her sleep. She said, "I need enough water security to go one dry summer without losing the herd. I need the fence lines tight enough that his men can't work them without it being plainly obvious. And I need somebody on this place that makes him think twice about the cost." I said, "I can do those things." She looked at me for a long time, not sizing me up this time, something different, something more careful. She said, "Why would you?" I said it was a fair place, and she was a fair person, and I hadn't had anything worth staying for in a long time. She didn't say anything to that. She picked the harness back up and went back to working it. But when I left the barn and went to get started on the north fence, I felt something settle into place that hadn't been settled in years. The feeling of being the right man in the right spot, the feeling of having weight to put on a scale that needed it. I spent the last 2 weeks of June on the water problem. The creek was fine for most of the year, but the upper reach went low in August, and what she needed was a second source for dry weather. There was a spring on the northeast corner of her property that Pickett knew about, and that Robert Marsh had meant to develop before he died. I went out and looked at it, and it was good, steady flow, clean, at a height that would let you channel it without a pump. I walked the route 3 times before I dug anything. Came out in the early morning with a stick, marking the soil, checking the grade by eye and feel the way I'd learned to do it. The land dropped 6 feet over about 140 yards, which was workable. Not easy, but workable. There were 2 places where I'd need to cut through rock shelf, and 1 place where I'd need to raise the channel bed above a natural dip in the ground, which meant building a form out of whatever lumber I could spare. I sat on the hillside and worked through the problems in my head before I touched a tool. I like that kind of work, the kind that's mostly thinking before it's digging. I started with the hard cuts, the rock shelf. Borrowed a bar and a heavy hammer from Pickett's tool cache in the barn and spent 3 days on my knees in the dirt working the rock, and by the end of the 3rd day, I'd gotten both cuts through and my hands were blistered under the calluses, and I was sleeping without dreaming, which was the truest sign of hard work done. The earth moving took longer. I dug the channel trench by hand, working from the spring downhill in sections. Some days Pickett came out and worked the shovel where his knee let him stand level, and he was a good worker, even diminished, economical with his movements, no wasted effort. We didn't talk much while we dug. We didn't need to. The work had its own language. Della came out in the evening sometimes and looked at the progress without saying much. Once she brought food out to us, biscuits and salt pork and a jar of water, wrapped in cloth to keep it warm, which she hadn't done before, and sat on a rock while we ate and asked questions about how the channel would behave in winter. She understood it fast, faster than most people would have. She asked about freeze depth, about whether the stone bed would hold without mortar, about the form I was building over the low section, and whether it would bear the weight of snow loading on the wooden frame. These weren't the questions of a person being polite. They were the questions of a person who would be maintaining this channel alone for years and needed to understand it. She knew her land in a way that I respected, not like a ledger, but in her body, the way Pickett did. She knew the particular smell the creek had after a thunderstorm and what it meant for the upstream soil. She knew which pasture corner got standing water in spring and for how long. She knew her own ground. The day I finished and opened the flow and we all 3 stood and watched the water come down the new channel and into the lower pasture trough, she put her hand on my arm. Just for a second. She didn't look at me when she did it. She was watching the water, but she put her hand on my arm and left it there for a moment before she took it back, and that small thing went into me and stayed there. Tate came in person in late July. He was a big man, well-dressed for ranch country, the kind of man who wore good boots to make you feel the difference between you and him. He had silver hair, iron-gray whiskers, and the kind of permanent tan that comes from years of being outdoors while other people do the work. He looked like authority. He'd learned, probably a long time ago, how to use the look of himself. He rode up to the house with 2 men behind him and called for Della the way a man calls for someone he doesn't think much of, loud, from the saddle, not dismounting. A man who doesn't get down is a man who isn't planning to stay long and wants you to know it. He's saying the outcome is already decided, and he's only here as courtesy. I was at the barn. I set down what I was doing, not in a hurry about it, and walked to the house. Not hurrying was deliberate. A man who hurries when somebody calls changes the shape of the situation before it starts. He looked at me the way he'd been planning to look at whoever was there, dismissive. A quick inventory, the kind of look that puts a man in a category before it's earned anything. And then something in his face shifted just slightly, the way it shifts when a man recalculates. He'd expected to see a hired hand, some quiet seasonal worker he could look through. I'm not sure what he saw instead. I've been working hard land for 30 years, and it was in how I stood. I looked back at him the way I'd learned to look at men like him, which is to say I didn't look away and I didn't look unfriendly. I just looked at him steady, the way you look at a fence post you're deciding whether to pull or brace. Waiting him out, not performing anything. Della came out of the house. She stood on the porch with her hands at her sides, no rifle, the pistol on her hip. She looked at Tate the same way she looked at everything, direct, nothing performed about it. Tate gave her a smile that didn't have any warmth in it and said he'd come to make her a final offer on the place, and that it was more than fair given the dry summer she'd had. He said dry summer the way a man says something he's prepared, a line he's thought about and practiced the tone of. Della said she hadn't had a particularly dry summer, that her water situation had improved considerably. He looked surprised. He hadn't been told that, which meant his men had been watching but not watching closely enough, or watching the wrong things. He shifted in the saddle. He said the offer stood regardless of water and named a figure. It was low, insultingly low, the kind of number you offer when you believe the other party has no choice and you want them to know you know it. I spoke then. I said it was a bad offer and we weren't interested, and that we'd appreciate him riding back the way he came. The we was deliberate. I said it that way on purpose. One word and it changed the geometry of the thing. He'd ridden up expecting a widow and whatever man she'd managed to hire for the season. What he got was something different, a place with 2 people in it who both meant to stay. One of his men behind him shifted in the saddle. The other one looked at Tate, which is what a man does when he's waiting to see how his employer handles a surprise. Tate looked at me for a long moment. He was trying to figure out what I was. Not a hired gun, I didn't look it and I hadn't acted it. Not a relation. Just a man standing on the ground of someone else's property like it was his own, which was the most confusing kind. The uncertainty was useful. He said, I wasn't talking to you. I said I understood that. I said he was welcome to go on talking to whoever he liked, but that the answer from this place was the same. We were not selling. He looked at Della. She said, you heard him. Something moved across Tate's face then that I recognized. It was the moment a man decides to rethink, to come back with a different approach, to reassess what he's up against before pushing harder. He wasn't done. But he was postponing, and the postponing was the thing. A man who's certain never postpones. He said, I'll be back. I said the coffee would be cold by then. He rode out. His 2 men rode with him. None of them looked back. Della came off the porch and stood beside me, and we both watched them go. She was close enough that I could feel the warmth of her in the air. She said quietly, he'll come back harder. I said I knew it. She said, are you going to still be here when he does? I looked at her. She was still watching the dust where they'd gone. I said yes. She nodded, one short nod, but different from the ones before. Something in it that she didn't say with words, something being put down that she'd been holding up for a long time. He came back harder on a Wednesday night in August. I'd been expecting it. Not that night particularly, but that kind of night. The kind a man sends men in when he can't go himself, can't afford to be seen as the one behind it. I'd been sleeping lighter since June, one ear tuned to the north fence line the way a man's ear tunes to a sound that matters. In open country at night you can hear a lot if you've trained yourself to hear it, and I had. 4 men, no Tate, no faces I could see in the dark. They came in from the north, the way I'd figured they would if they came at night, because that was the least light and the worst ground for anybody defending. They cut the north fence in 2 places and pushed through with horses, and the noise of that woke me. Not just the fence wire, but the particular way their horses moved. 4 sets of hooves in ground I'd walked enough times that I knew the sound of it. I was out of the bunkhouse before they were 30 yards inside the fence line. The air was cold, late summer cold that comes down fast in the high places, and the stars were out hard and bright, which gave me more to see by than they'd counted on. I won't make a story of what happened. It was ugly and it was brief, which is what a fight in the dark is. One of them had a rifle and used it. The bullet went wide. I heard it go past on my left, higher than my head, the hiss of it that you never forget once you've heard it. I had a rifle too, and I'm a better shot than most, and I put 2 rounds into the ground close enough to the horses that they spooked bad. And in the chaos of that, the 4 men had a different problem than the one they'd come looking for. Horses that have heard close gunfire and panicked are not horses a man controls without both hands and full attention, and that's enough time. Pickett came out of the bunkhouse behind me, bad knee and all, with a scattergun he must have had since before the war, and stood in the dark and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. Sometimes presence is enough. Sometimes the shape of a man standing quiet and armed in the dark is all the argument needed. They left harder than they came. I stood in the dark for a while after, listening to the night settle back down. An owl somewhere to the east that had gone quiet during the noise of it and now came back. The cattle moving around in the lower pasture, unsettled, their hooves muffled in the grass. The creek sound, steady and indifferent, the way water is indifferent to everything men do near it. I had a fine tremor in my hands that I made into fists until it stopped. That happened sometimes after, the body wanting to release what the mind had held still. I'd learned to let it pass without fighting it. Della came out of the house. She'd heard it, but she'd stayed inside. I'd asked her to do that the week before, told her if anything came in the night she should stay inside and keep the lamp down, and to her credit she had. She came out now with the lamp and a rifle and stood in the yard looking at the north fence where I'd been standing, and then she looked at me. I walked toward her. The lamp lit her face from below. There were things in her face I hadn't seen before, or maybe I had and hadn't let myself look at. Relief, which she would have been angry to have visible but couldn't quite keep hidden. And something else, something steadier than relief. She looked at where I'd come from at the north fence and the darkness beyond it. She looked at me. She said, "You all right?" I said I was. She reached out and touched my face with her free hand. The side of my face, her palm against my jaw, the way a woman touches something she's afraid might not be real. She held it there for just a moment, and her hand was warm and the night was cold, and I was aware of both at once. She said, "I didn't know if you'd come out of that." I said I came out. She took her hand back. She looked out at the dark for a while longer. Then she lowered the lamp a little, and the darkness thickened around us. She said, "I'll put coffee on." I said that'd be good. We went inside. Pickett came in behind us, set the scattergun against the wall with the care of a man returning something to its proper place, sat in the chair by the fire like he'd been sitting in that chair his whole life. Della made coffee. I sat at the table. Nobody said much. The lamp made a little circle of light and we were inside it, the 3 of us, and outside it was dark and quiet and the cattle had settled back to grazing and the night held no more trouble in it that I could feel. I rode to town the next morning. The town was 14 miles east, which was close enough to matter and far enough that you rode in with intention. I'd been twice before for supplies, and I'd used those trips to pay attention, which is something I'd learned to do in strange places. Look at who talks to who gives way to who on the street, whose name comes up when people talk about money or trouble. Tate's name came up on both counts. He had credit at the bank and interests in a couple of the supply outfits and a brother-in-law on the town council, and he'd arranged things over the years the way a patient man arranges them, quietly, without making it obvious, so that the shape of his influence was only visible if you were already looking for it. The shape was visible to me. I found the county clerk's office on the east side of the main street, and I spent 2 hours there with the land records. The clerk was a young man who looked like he'd been told to be suspicious of questions and didn't know exactly how to do it. I told him I was looking at water rights assessments in the lower valley, and he brought me the binders without making it a conflict. The land records are dry documents. They have a smell, old binders, and something underneath, dust and ink and the dried-up decisions of men who are mostly dead now. I worked through them carefully. What I found was that Tate's south pasture, the one he'd been claiming had inadequate water, had 2 documented springs on record, both assessed in 1869, both still active as of the last survey done in 1871. Not marginal springs, rated as reliable year-round sources, good mineral content, adequate flow for cattle. He'd been lying about the water for years. He'd always had enough water. What he wanted was Della's Creek, not because he needed it to survive, but because it was superior water, and because controlling it would give him a stranglehold on the whole lower valley, over every operation that depended on the creek downstream. It wasn't desperation that had been driving this. It was greed in the shape of a long strategy. He'd been patient for 3 years, since Robert Marsh died, building toward the moment when a widow with 38 acres and a bad-kneed hand and no protection would either sell cheap or collapse. He'd cultivated the conditions of her vulnerability, the way a man cultivates soil, slowly, making it worse season by season, until the moment the numbers were in his favor. I sat with the binders for a while after finding the spring's assessment, not moving, just sitting with it. The clerk glanced at me once and looked away. Then I gathered what I had and went to find Hodge. The county land agent had his office in a wooden building off the south end of the street that needed paint but had a solid door, which told you something about a man's priorities. Hodge himself was about 60, broad-shouldered, with a gray beard he kept neatly, and the hands of a man who'd done land work before he got the desk job. He looked at me when I came in the way. A man looks at someone he doesn't know but is willing to hear. I sat across from him and I laid it out. The springs on record. The water claim Tate had been using as a pretext for 3 years. The fence incidents on Della's property with dates. I'd been writing them down in a small notebook since June, dates and descriptions, not because I knew I'd use them, but because it was the kind of man I'd decided to be about this. The night riders, which was a crime regardless of who gave the order, and which I could describe in specific terms. Hodge listened to all of it. He asked questions, good ones, the kind that probe for whether a man is telling what he knows or telling what he wants to believe. He had the look of a man who'd known something was wrong and hadn't had enough in front of him to do anything about it, and was now looking at enough. He said he'd be out to survey the springs on Tate's land within a week. I said I appreciated it. He said the Marsh place. That the widow? I said yes. He said there's people in this town been waiting for somebody to come along and make that situation right. She held on longer than most figured she would. I didn't say anything to that. It wasn't my story to add to. I rode back. When I got back, Della was mending a section of fence on the east side herself, alone, because Pickett's knee had finally given him a bad day and she'd told him to rest. She was in the afternoon sun with her sleeves rolled up, and she didn't stop working when I rode up, just looked at me and back at the fence. I got down and took the wire pliers from her and finished the section. She stood back and watched. When I was done, she handed me a canteen and I drank from it. I told her what I'd found, what I'd taken to Hodge. She was quiet for a long time after, looking at the fence. Then she said, "He won't just let it go because of a survey." I said no, probably not right away. But the ground under him was going to shift. Men who'd been staying clear would start making different calculations when they saw official attention on his land. The ones who'd been tolerating him, because he seemed solid, would have to reconsider. A man with a water claim that turns out to be false doesn't wear the same face in a county anymore. She said, "He's got money and patience." I said, "And now we've got the record and the daylight." She looked at me, she said, "We." I said it again, "We." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she looked away at the pasture, at the grass going gold in the late sun, at the cattle spread out and grazing slow and easy, at the water channel running silver in the distance. She said, "I built this place with Robert. I thought when he died I'd have to give it over to someone, either sell it or let it fall to pieces." She stopped. She wasn't a woman who talked around the edges of things. "I'm not going to do that." I said I knew she wasn't. She said, "I'm not asking you to stay." I said I knew that too. She said, "But if you were to stay?" I said I was going to stay. She didn't say anything else for a moment. The late sun was full on her face and the wind was moving through the grass, and she stood there with her hands at her sides, not relaxed exactly, but settled. Something in her that had been braced for a long time, quietly. In the private way strong people brace themselves against things they don't talk about. I could see it ease a little. Just a little. She said, "Then there's a fence post on the south line that needs pulling." I said I'd get it tomorrow. She said, "Good." Tate sent a lawyer in September. The lawyer was from Denver, young, well-dressed, carrying a briefcase that he held with both hands like it might run off. He sat across the kitchen table from Della and me with his papers, and explained in careful language that his client was prepared to revise his offer significantly upward, and that he hoped the situation could be resolved to everyone's satisfaction without the county land agent's inquiry proceeding further. Della poured coffee for the lawyer and sat down and listened to the whole thing. When he was done, she said, "No, thank you." The lawyer said he hoped she understood that his client remained very interested in the property, and that it might be some time before an offer of this size. She said, "I understand that." He looked at me. I said, "She told you." The lawyer gathered his papers and left. Della watched him ride out from the window. She said, "He sent a lawyer." I said, "He's not sure what he's dealing with anymore." She said, "Good." When I came back from seeing the lawyer out, Della was washing dishes at the basin. She didn't turn around right away. I heard the water stop and she stood there for a moment with her hands in the basin, and then she said, "He's scared." I said I thought that was right. She said, "Men like that don't send lawyers when they feel safe." I said, "No, they don't." She dried her hands on a cloth and turned around and looked at me. She said, "You did that, the survey and the records and bringing it all to Hodge. I didn't ask you to do that." I said I knew she hadn't. She said, "I'm saying I know it wasn't nothing. It cost you time, and I know you paid attention for months before you went, building the case." I said it needed doing. She looked at me a while. Then she said, "Thank you," straight, no looking away, no making it smaller than it was. Just the two words given plainly, which was how she did everything. I said she was welcome. She turned back to the dishes. Hodge's survey confirmed the springs. In October, a notice went into the county record correcting the water rights claim on Tate's south property. It was dry language in a government ledger, but the effect in the valley was not dry at all. People who'd been quiet had reasons to talk. Two other ranchers who'd had fence trouble they'd attributed to other causes started looking at those causes differently. Tate sold a section of his east acreage in November. The man I'd heard was his best hand left the operation before winter. None of that was dramatic. It wasn't supposed to be. That's not how these things end. They end with the arithmetic shifting, slowly, without ceremony, until the other side's patience costs more than it returns. I didn't see Tate again that year. In December, the first real snow came, 2 feet in one night, and we spent the next 3 days working the herd, checking the water channel, making sure the cattle had access to the creek below where it froze. It was cold work, miserable work, the kind of cold that gets into your hands and stays there for days. The world went white and still, and the only sound most of the time was the wind off the mountains and the cattle moving slow and reluctant through the drifts. On the second night of it, I had to get up at 2 in the morning because one of the younger cows had found a place to calve behind the south barn, which was about the worst choice she could have made in terms of shelter and warmth. And I spent 2 hours in the dark in the snow with a lantern getting that calf on its feet and getting both of them into the barn proper. The calf was white-faced and shaky and breathed in little clouds. I stayed with it until it found its legs, kneeling in the straw with my coat open and the calf pressed against me for warmth, which is not glamorous work, but it is the work. When I came back and I was half frozen. Della was up. She'd heard me go out and waited, and when I came through the door she was at the stove with the fire going and a pan heating up. She looked at my hands and said, "Come here," and I sat at the kitchen table, and she put my hands in a basin of water that was just warm enough to ache and stood there while the feeling came back into them. She didn't make a thing of it. She didn't say anything about being up at 2 in the morning and worried. She just stood there while my hands thawed, and then she made eggs because the eggs were what was ready. On the second evening, before the snow stopped, I came in and sat down at the table and just sat there for a minute doing nothing, which I almost never did. She set a plate in front of me without asking. She sat down across from me. She said, "Tell me something about yourself." I said, "What do you want to know?" She said, "Anything. You've been here 8 months, and I know you can fix a channel and hold a fence line and you make bad coffee, but that's most of it." I thought about it for a while. Not performing the thinking, just actually thinking, going through what I could tell and what I wanted to keep, and deciding the difference didn't matter as much as I'd been acting like it did. I told her about a place in Montana I'd been once, a high valley in September with the aspens turning and the elk bugling at night, that I'd thought about more times than I could count. I told her I'd thought sometimes that I'd go back there someday. But that someday was the kind of word a man uses when he can't be honest about probably never. I told her about a horse I'd had for 12 years that was so smart it was almost uncomfortable. A bay gelding named Nothing, because I'd never given horses names, but he'd known his own name somehow anyway, the unnamed thing that he was, and he'd died in his sleep in a corral in Utah, and I'd buried him myself and said nothing about it to anyone and thought about it still. I told her about the situation in New Mexico, the whole of it, the foreman years and the man I'd worked for and the year I'd stayed too long. I told it straight, no making myself look better than I was, no polishing the corners of it. I'd been comfortable. I'd been complicit. I'd known the man was crooked in ways that cost other people, and I'd told myself the work was good, and the pay was fair, and those things were true, and they also weren't enough. And when I'd finally left, I'd known the leaving was about a year late. She listened to all of it. She didn't shift in her chair or look away or give me the kind of look that's sympathy arranged to look like understanding. She just listened the way she looked at fence line, direct, taking inventory, not rushing to a conclusion. When I was done, she said, "You stayed too long because you were comfortable." I said yes. She said, "Most men stay too long in the wrong place for the same reason." I said, "Probably so." She said, "You're not there anymore." I said I wasn't. She looked at me across the table. The lamp between us. The snow outside, the wind picking up, The cattle settled in the pasture with enough hay to see them through to morning. She said, "I'm glad you followed the horse." I said I was too. We sat there a while longer, not needing anything else from the evening. The fire popped. The wind moved around the eaves of the house. Outside in the barn, the new calf was on its feet and warm and breathing, which was enough of a good thing for one cold night. Spring came again. The water channel performed exactly as I'd said it would. March runoff was heavy and the diversion held. I went out and checked it the first morning of real snowmelt, walked the whole length of it from the spring to the lower trough, and there was a small washout at the form section I'd had doubts about, which I repaired in half a day. But the channel itself held, the stone bed held, and the water came down clean and steady and filled the lower trough by afternoon. I stood and watched it fill, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing working that you built with your hands and thought through in your head, the satisfaction that comes from no other place. The upper pasture stayed green 2 weeks longer than it had the year before, Pickett said, and Pickett didn't say things like that unless they were true. Pickett's knee didn't get better, but it didn't get worse, which we agreed was close enough to a miracle. In April, he started coming out to the south fence in the mornings and doing light work, and I didn't say anything about the light, just let him work at the pace that held and covered the rest without making it a thing. He was proud. You don't take a proud man's pride because his knee is bad. The herd went a 22 head with the spring calves. Della made a decision about which bull to bring in for the fall that was better than the one I'd suggested. She'd seen something in the county records about the bloodlines that I hadn't looked at, and her reasoning was right. And I told her so, which made her look at me like I'd grown a second head, because she was not used to being told she was right. I told her she was going to have to get used to it. She said she'd work on it. There was a morning in April when I was out working the east fence, a long run of it that needed new posts in 5 places, and I looked up from the ground and across the pasture to the house, and I saw her on the porch with a cup in her hands, looking out at the valley. Just standing there easy, nothing requiring her attention at that moment, and I thought, it went through me like a current, this is what settled looks like on her. I hadn't seen it before. She'd been braced for so long in so many ways that the absence of the brace was a new thing on her body and in her face, and from across the pasture in the April morning light, it was something I couldn't look away from. I went back to the fence post, but I thought about it the rest of the day. In the evenings we sat on the porch when the weather allowed and watched the valley, the light going off the grass, the distant mountains still white at the top. We didn't talk about Tate. We didn't need to. He was still out there, running his operation, smaller now and quieter. The arithmetic had shifted. He'd found something else to want, or he'd decided to want this thing less. Either way, it was over in the way that mattered. She was beside me on the porch one evening in late April, the air still cold but with something in it that wasn't winter anymore, and she put her hand through my arm, not asking anything, just resting it there, the way she'd touched my arm at the water channel. Her hand in the crook of my arm and the two of us looking at the same valley. She said, "I think I forgot what it was like." I said, "What?" She said, "To have somebody to look at this with." I turned and looked at her. She was looking at the valley, not at me, but she knew I was looking. She said, "I'm all right, you know. I want you to know I was managing." I said, "I know you were." She said, "I just mean I'm not. I'm not telling you I needed rescuing." I said I didn't think she was. She said, "I needed a good man." She turned and looked at me then. Right at me steady, the way she looked at everything, the fence line, the water channel, a calf that might be sick. Whole attention, nothing withheld. She said, "And you're a good man." I held her eyes. I didn't say anything for a moment because there wasn't anything that would add to it. A good woman looking at you and telling you plainly what you are, there's not much that touches it. There's not much a man carries longer than that. I said, "I'm trying to be." She said, "I know." She settled her hand a little firmer in the crook of my arm and turned back to the valley. That's what I mean. We stayed like that until the last of the light was gone, and the valley went to dark shapes, and the first stars were out, and the cold had come all the way down, and neither of us moved to go inside. The roan mare, Lily, was in the near pasture. I could see her in the last light, drifting along the fence line the way she did in the evenings, not restless, just moving. She'd stay on the right side of the fence these days. She'd figured out over the past year that there was no need to push through. Everything she needed was here. I'd thought about that some. About what makes a creature stop running. It's not walls. It's not wire. It's having something worth staying for, good water and good grass, and the company of other horses that don't make you nervous. I'd ridden a long way. I'd left a lot behind me. I hadn't been looking for a place to land when I found this one. But I'd found it. She was beside me, and the valley was in front of us, and the stars were coming out one by one, and I had a roof over my head that I'd earned the right to be under, and I knew what I was in this place. Needed, known, and held by something real. It was enough. It was more than I'd had in a long time. More than I'd thought I'd have again.